Good morning to all of those who are joining us from the United States, North America, and anywhere where it's the morning there. And good afternoon, good evening for those who are joining us overseas. We are here today for the 8th webinar of the Washington Kurdish Institute. I welcome you all the participants and the attendees to discuss scenarios on U.S. policy towards Iran after November 3 elections, and depending on who will win and who will lose the elections, and regardless of who will win and who will lose the elections. So I'm joined today with three distinguished guests, the panelists, Michael Pregent, Dr. Andrew Apostolou, and Dr. Kamal Soleimani. Let me give a very brief but very interesting details of their biographies, and then to give a small opening remarks to continue with the short presentations of our panelists, and then to carry on with the questions and answers. Michael Pregent is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. He's a senior Middle East analyst, a former lecturer for the College of International Security and Security Affairs, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and the National Defense University. Mr. Pregent is a former intelligence officer with 28 years of experience working in security, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and policy issues across the world, but especially in the Middle East and North Africa. That also includes Southwest Asia. He is definitely an expert in Middle East and North Africa political and security issues, counterterrorism, and other things concerning Iran. He spent considerable time working on the Iranian influence in Iraq, which he's known for his commentaries on the media and social media, like regarding Iran and Iraq alike. And he was in an embedded role as an advisor with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki of Iraq in the past. Dr. Andrew Apostolou is a foreign policy expert. By the way, Michael Pregent is joining us from Arlington, Virginia. And one important point about his recent history is that he has been to at least 10 states in the past 3 weeks, talking with community leaders and ordinary citizens about the elections and the U.S. foreign policy, and we'll be very much delighted to hear their comments and opinions. Andrew Apostolou is a foreign policy expert based in Washington, D.C. He has worked on human rights campaigns in the Middle East. He was previously the director for Iran at Freedom House, America's leading human rights and democracy promotion organization. He has testified to the Congress about the Iranian regime and its human rights abuses, and has published widely on Iran and the Middle East. Dr. Kamal Soleimani, he specialized in Islamic and Middle Eastern history and politics. And he received his PhD in 2014 in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies from Columbia University in New York. He has taught at Turkish and American universities in the past. He's joining us from Mexico. He has excellent insights on the internal dynamics of Iran that we will very much delighted to hear. As I mentioned before the short bios, we will be discussing possible policy shifts in the U.S. approach towards Iran and in the era post the U.S. elections in November. Let me give a brief picture on how divided the intellectual community is when it comes to the U.S. policy after the elections towards Iran. To start with some interesting developments, statements, and an analysis that all came actually within the past week, and one in early August. So in early August 2020, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, William McVeigh, published this report announcing that several states have their own preferences regarding the U.S. elections, and they might try to manipulate American public opinion. And in this publication, Iran was mentioned as the country that prefers Joe Biden instead of Donald Trump, which as an argument was used by President Trump without naming this report, who said definitely Iran prefers Joe Biden to become the president. And interestingly, several Iranian experts agreed with the U.S. National Intelligence Director. One of them was Ali Omeidi from Isfahan University, who said in an interesting commentary to a Western newspaper that the Iranian people and the elite prefer Biden over Donald Trump because he mentioned that Trump is an existential threat to Iran. I'm not sure if all our panelists agree with this proposition, but according to Ali Omeidi, only a marginalized, hawkish, conservative community in Iran prefers Trump instead of Joe Biden because they consider that Trump's victory could strengthen Iran's conservative policies and isolationism without another functioning or malfunctioning deal with Western states. In a rather criticized commentary, the US ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, said yesterday that to a Emirati newspaper, by the way, which is the most interesting part of this story, that Biden's election could undermine US policy and US efforts against Iran. This comment was criticized because it came from a diplomat who was not supposed to make these remarks. As we all know, two aspects of the US policy regarding Iran are taking the attention these days. And one of them is the rapprochement between Israel and Gulf states, specifically the UAE and Bahrain, which signed an agreement with Israel, which is also considered an agreement that is part of the U.S. policy of encircling Iran, which can also lead to possible Iranian presence, possible Israeli presence in the Gulf. I will have questions about this towards the end of our conversation. And the second aspect is, of course, Iranian influence in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan, where the most challenged US allies actually sit. Without further ado, I'd like to allocate up to 10 minutes to each panelist to speak about their insights regarding the US policy towards Iran today and the possible US policy or policy shift towards Iran in the aftermath of the elections. Dr. Soleimani, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind, to give us an overview of your insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this. To begin with, the U.S. has not had any coherent policy for the last 10 years about the Middle East to begin with. So during the Obama era, Obama pretty much left Iraq to a sect or to Shiites. As there was a cartoon that Obama gave a car's key to al-Maliki, the time's prime minister, which it was certainly a campaign promise that he took, but at the same, it was a reckless decision that he made, which created a chaos in Iraq. It really strengthened the Islamic State, ISIS, and pretty much caused the devastation of the entire Sunni civilization it was one of the things that helped that in both Iraq and in Syria. So in some ways, Trump's policies are similar to Obama's when it comes to the Middle East, except for sanctions on Iran. Trump has not had any consistent policies about even Iran. Even when, despite the fact the sanctions been very effective in many ways, although the pro-Iranian lobby tries to blame the US and especially Trump for every single misery that goes on under the Islamic Republic and all the problems that people are facing daily. But the reality is, even before the sanctions, just 2 years ago, there was a widespread demonstration in Iran, and we had about 110 cities demonstrating against the very bad economic conditions that were really without precedent in the Islamic Republic's history. But even I was talking about Donald Trump's consistency with regard to the sanctions. But when it comes to the other aspects of his policies, they have been completely inconsistent. So, and Donald Trump did not lead any coalition, did not lead the world, and he did not have any or has not have any strategies to really unite the world against the Iranian regime. One more thing about Obama era, I'm kind of going back and forth because of the time limit. Obama's policies helped Iran to follow its expansionist policies in the region. And it really tried to, by being influential or having a pretty much direct presence in a variety of Arab countries and neighboring countries, to strengthen itself and create some kind of Persian nationalism by talking about a strong state that has a presence around the world. So to come back to the situation, when you look at this situation and the lack of coherent strategy for the entire Middle East, when it comes to the post-election, we really don't have, we have no idea we might happen after the election. Mr. Biden still talks about going back to what they call it Iran deal, which it had good components, but in many ways could not prevent Iran from creating a nuclear bomb or nuclear weapons. And we have videos that are available on YouTube that Ali Akbar Salehi, who was the head of the Iranian nuclear industry, talks about the fact how, especially for the Natanz side, there were certain components, I don't know the technological things, certain components that they were supposed to destroy, but before destroying them, they had already bought them from black market. And these videos are available. And in terms of other weaponry like missiles and other things, which we have seen what happened with Saudi Arabia and what's going on in Yemen, they have pretty much been expanding this kind of weapons, and they are actually updating them and enhancing them on a daily basis. So despite the fact that Joe Biden talks about going back to the deal and talking about the danger that Iran poses, he hasn't offered any details how he's going back to the deal, whether it would be unconditional, whether there will be certain new provisions to the deal. So it's completely unclear. And despite the fact that many parties in the Middle East would really expect something from the US to even if they go back to that deal, there should be certain things that prevent this, that prevents Iran from expanding or enhancing its weaponry. So when it comes to Donald Trump, it's completely unclear what kind of directions he may take. Partly his policies about Iran, yes, there has been, as I said, consistencies about the sanctions, but it has been pretty much an extension of internal or US domestic policies. It has been mostly like a spite against Obama rather than having a well-decided, well-defined policy that could, as I said, bring allies together and so make the sanctions effective to the degree that revolutionary guards would stop and the regime will stop. These proxy wars will stop, helping all the terrorist groups around the world from the Middle East to Latin America. So nothing has, or maybe it's been in some ways effective, but the regime has not abandoned these strategies in terms of helping various groups around the world, partly because probably they are waiting for the US elections and see what is going to happen. One more thing about Donald Trump that, as I said, it's a completely unknown because Donald Trump himself is unpredictable. Someone doesn't even listen to his own advisors, and he's a constant, or he was in constant fight with them. That even for this, just for the sake of making a deal for a photo op, Donald Trump could have a deal with the Iranians just to say that I have a deal, which is a completely reckless and dangerous, and the entire US policy in the last 10 years have been pretty much irresponsible. It started with preventing the Kurds in 2014 from having a referendum, which made them postpone it. And then we had the massacres and the genocide that happened to the Yazidis. And we had all sorts of other problems that followed it. And now, thanks to Donald Trump and the previous administration, we have Russia, Turkey, and Iran now calling the shot in the Middle East. So the situation is extremely dire. And even what we have in Azerbaijan could be partly because of the US's lack of responsibility when it comes to its recent foreign policy. So when it comes to the Kurdish situation, what we have in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Before you go to the Kurdish situation, maybe I want to leave this to the questions because you made some important points here that I took a lot of notes, especially comparing just Trump policies to Obama's policies and actually saying that those have been similar. And one of your points was that Donald Trump, despite the sanctions and its effectiveness, haven't been leading a coalition against Iran. The sanctions did not end creating a unified world response to Iran. So, Dr. Apostolou, based on this, on these points, especially focusing on the similarities and differences between the Trump policy and Obama policy towards Iran, and the effectiveness of the sanctions, do you agree with with Dr. Soleimani's argument that that the sanctions have been effective on Iran, but in the absence of a unified global coalition, or at least a Western coalition, the U.S. policy cannot be considered coherent and consistent? But you can also add your own insights regarding other topics that Dr. Soleimani mentioned.
Well, as you asked nicely, I will.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with Professor Soleimani. We met at an event with some rather gruesome Iranian regime apologists. Let me put this into context. The general US approach to Iran since the 90s, when the focus has been on the nuclear issue, has been nukes to normalization. The idea has been that you use a mixture of sanctions and interdiction to either slow down or even stop the nuclear program, push the Iranian regime into negotiations, talk about nukes, talk about regional destabilization, talk about terrorism, talk about human rights, and then end up with normalization. And what has happened is, you know, the sanctions have had a very strong economic effect. The political effect is a little more ambiguous. Interdiction has been extremely effective, although America hasn't done much of it. It's somebody else who popped off those Iranian nuclear scientists. It's somebody else who seized the Iranian nuclear archive, and it's somebody else who may have been behind that terrible work accident at Natanz in July. You know, kids, be careful with centrifuges. And so that's been a more effective tool. What Trump and Obama have done very interestingly, and I think Professor Soleimani is absolutely right about the similarity here, is they've kind of moved away from that framework. And that's because, let's face it, both of them are coming at foreign policy from an essentially isolationist stance. I mean, this is the big story in US foreign policy in the last dozen or so years, which is that isolationism has moved from the extremes to the mainstream. It started with the Democrats in George W. Bush's second term. They deeply regretted supporting the war in Iraq. There were many Republicans who agreed with them, but they kept quiet because, as we've learned, partisanship goes a very long way in American politics. And then, of course, in 2016, Donald Trump liberated the Republican Party from the shackles of internationalism and human rights. So what's happened is Obama came in and he said, forget nukes to normalization. We're never going to get there with this regime. Let's just focus on the nukes. He disregarded a lot of the regional destabilization. He let regional powers deal with that. And he used human rights as an instrument. And when it came to the nuclear accord that Professor Soleimani talked about, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA of 2015, Obama's approach was to aim low, but the problem was he missed. So the JCPOA deals mostly with the fissile material, but it left out the whole problem of weaponization, and it left out the issue of delivery systems, the missiles. And as we found out from when the Israelis seized the Iranian nuclear archive in April 2018, in fact, Iran had done an awful lot of work on this, was planning to make 5 10 kiloton bombs, was looking at sites for nuclear tests. And the best part of it, I think, and it's worth looking this up if you know the ISIS website, is that they actually had in the archive so-called deception folders, because they needed to keep their story straight when they lied to the inspectors. So they actually had, you know, these are the lies you have to tell in the next meeting, so they're consistent with the lies we told in the previous meeting. And I have to say, that's a glory of record keeping, and that's something that all dictatorial regimes are really good at, and it always works against them. So Obama, as I said, he aimed low, he missed. Trump is similar, but as Professor Soleimani quite rightly said, incoherent. So there's focus on the nuclear issue, tremendous use of sanctions. I mean, the funny thing about sanctions is that in the last 10 years, the United States has sanctioned the Central Bank of Iran twice, which is, you know, quite an achievement. People have never sanctioned central banks before, and you've done it twice. What also Trump did, which was different, however, to Obama, is he actually took action on the regional front. And he's been willing to use force to protect American interests in Iraq. The most notable example was the killing of Soleimani. Now, I know a lot of the Iran apologists were very upset about this, but look at the positive side. Soleimani missed COVID-19. Human rights have been forgotten. And then there's been this incoherence, and it's partly, again, from that isolationist stance. So Pompeo gave this speech in May 2018 outlining 12 conditions for Iran, offering normalization, threatening to crush Iranian operatives and proxies in the Middle East, a kind of an S&M approach to foreign policy. And then a year later, in June 2019, he offered talks without preconditions. So not exactly coherent. And then similarly, Trump has made very dire threats against Iran. He recently said, after the revelations of a possible plot against the American ambassador in South Africa, that the retaliation would be 1,000 times what Iran did, which sounds great, but at the same time, for domestic reasons, he's running on, I will bring the troops home and no more crazy wars in the Middle East. So it's certainly a mixed message. What is consistent, though, between Obama and Trump as well is, of course, walking away from the Kurds. Obama did it. Actually, Biden was involved with Euphrates Shield. And of course, Trump did it in both Iraq and Syria. And that sends a very interesting message to the Iranian regime, because, as you know, the Iranian regime was very worried about the way in which a number of Kurds had gone from Iran to Syria to fight against ISIS. And I'm sure, Jane, you saw the wonderful interview done by the BBC in Kobani, in which an Iranian Kurd said, I'm here to fight ISIS, but the regime in Iran is next. That's a very worrying thing. And an empowered Kurdish movement anywhere in the Middle East worries the Iranians. And the US has done them a huge favor by pulling the rug out in both Iraq and in Syria. So the thing I think we need to think about next, and where I think actually a new US presidential term is an opportunity for a rethink of policy, is there are two big forces happening in Iran internally right now, and they're very worrying. One of them is coming from within the regime. Because of internal regime conflicts and because of the perverse impact of sanctions, what you're seeing is the emergence of a criminal state within the criminal regime. And that criminal state is controlled by people from the IRGC, particularly the Quds Force. They've put a fair amount of money outside the country. They've got money inside. They've got some forces of coercion inside with them. And they are in a very strong position to survive whatever comes next. They will survive a change of government. They will survive a change of supreme leader. They will probably survive a change of regime. And this will look rather similar to what happened in Russia. So I think what's likely in Iran is, for all the talk we had in the past about how the youth bulge would get rid of the regime and how the dissident movement would challenge the regime and there'd be the emergence of a democratic culture, the most likely thing next is a criminal nationalist authoritarian state. The other big force in Iran is exactly as Professor Soleimani said, these protests. But I think these protests come in two forms. There are the protests, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Professor Soleimani, within Kurdish areas and Arab areas, Ahwaz, Kurdistan, etc. But then there are the protests in central Iran. And what you're seeing there is a result of economic, social, and environmental forces, people moving into the cities, moving into the margins of the cities, moving into the slums. And these people are the genuine dispossessed. These people are the genuine oppressed of the earth. And they are angry. They have no agenda. They have no leader. But their movement is extremely destructive and threatening to the regime. And the worst thing that could happen is a combination of those two forces. The worst thing that could happen is that somebody from within that criminal state within a state realizes that there is this movement in Iran that they can lead and that they can use a form of nationalism or authoritarianism.
Apparently we lost Andrew, but I was going to stop him anyway.
Sorry, we were slightly interrupted there. That's one of the biggest challenges for US policy, is to deal with those two forces within Iran. And I frankly don't think I see anything from either political party in America right now that addresses this. But in part, that's because America's kind of got its own problems at the moment. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Apostolou. By the way, the attendees can start posting their questions in the QA button that you see below the screens, and we'll take the questions after Mr. Pregent's remarks. Mr. Pregent, Dr. Soleimani and Dr. Apostolou agree on one thing, that the US policy is not consistent, is not coherent, be it Trump or be it Obama. They both agree that that the sanctions could have been more effective if a global coalition was led by the US against Iran, and if neither Obama or Trump were isolationist. In fact, both Dr. Soleimani and Dr. Apostolou mentioned that Trump and Obama moved from traditional US policies towards a more isolationist approach towards Iran. And Dr. Apostolou also mentioned something interesting this time, which is he claims that the sanctions are strengthening the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, which could eventually decide to lead the force, the energy created by the social unrest, who are currently lacking a leader. Based on these remarks, do you agree that the US policy towards Iran is actually an isolationist approach, or sanctions prove that the Trump policy has been coherent and consistent and is not isolationist?
Okay, hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be a part of the panel with such esteemed voices talking about this issue. I think the Trump policy is very coherent to the regime. It may not be coherent to us in academia. It may not be coherent to the American people, but the regime is hearing loud and clear that the policy is one that they are so worried about that they are actually hoping that Biden wins. And that is a strong message. I would say that in 2012, when we had an international coalition to put sanctions on Iran, to bring them to the table, to talk about the JCPOA, those sanctions were very effective. That was some of the harshest punishment the regime had received. The U.S. alone, with its sanctions and now with snapback, have hurt the Iranian economy and the regime worse than 2012 on its own. So the U.S. going alone with U.S. secondary sanctions, U.S. sanctions, critics said that wouldn't work. It has worked. And when I talk to the Iranian diaspora, when I talk to people about sanctions, they want the United States to keep sanctions in place. They want the sanctions to stay in place. They want no negotiations with the regime, because any lifeline to the regime sustains it and kills these protests and kills these protest movements. And so from what I've heard, and again, I'm just a gringo in the United States looking at this stuff, but I look at it through the lens of people inside of the country. The United States, the sanctions as part of maximum pressure and the snapback sanctions are very effective, and they want them kept in place. Otherwise, the regime survives this. And, you know, I understand the argument that this may strengthen the IRGC, but that's really a call to lift sanctions. That's really a call to give a break to this regime. And I reject that from a position that I look at that as a nice problem to have. If you have a pragmatic IRGC commander in charge of everything, then he understands hard power, soft power, and smart power. And I look at that as a nice problem to have. A definitive target, a target that the people would only follow if it was an authoritarian type of government, and that means they would rebel against it. One of the biggest problems the United States has is, you know, we don't put a spotlight on the human atrocities or the human rights atrocities that are taking place in Iran. The international community doesn't. If there are protests in Ahwaz, the media will show the government-supported protests in Tehran. One protester is killed for protesting. The other protester is made to go outside and protest on behalf of the government under threat of punishment. So those are things that we need to look at. So let's talk about the policy today. The policy today is maximum pressures in place. Some of my colleagues that were in the Trump administration wanted Trump to negotiate an Iran deal before the election. Others, those of us in this camp, said this is not the time to negotiate with Iran. We can negotiate with Iran after the elections. Whether Trump wins or loses, Trump will still be in power until January 17th or January 20th of 2021. And the sanctions that U.S. Treasury has put in place and the snapback sanctions aren't simply something that Joe Biden can just walk back. Remember, in 2015, Obama had the pressure on senators to support the JCPOA. The Obama machine was so powerful that it could primary Democrat senators who were opposed to the JCPOA. There's no appetite in DC for renegotiating the Iran deal. It may be an appetite when it comes to, you know, people in the Obama administration. But if Biden wins, his focus is going to be China. Iran is not going to be one of these conversations that you can simply, have by writing some executive order or doing something like the JCPOA. Senator Schumer, Senator Menendez have said that any future deal has to be one that is ratified by the Senate. So it can't be torn up by the next president or a future administration. They also saw what Iran did under the JCPOA. Like Andrew said, the JCPOA was only meant to deal with the nuclear portfolio. However, it re-energized everything Qasem Soleimani was doing by lifting sanctions on entities, individuals, and banks under Annex 2 that basically accelerated and gave energy to everything Qasem Soleimani was doing in Iraq, wanted to do in Syria, and wanted to do in Yemen. So we are where we are today. And again, our adversaries are hoping for an election outcome that favors them. If Biden wins, I would argue that your hand has been strengthened. You can negotiate with Iran from a position of strength and get a deal that addresses regional behavior, get a deal that addresses ballistic missiles, get a deal that allows U.S. inspectors 24/7 access. Remember that caveat that no inspector could be an American or a Canadian. Because, when we travel overseas, a lot of Americans say, I'm from Canada. And as soon as you say that, they know you're an American just trying to hide it. I normally say I'm from Texas, and that seems to work. The regime is probably going to collapse on its own in the next year to 4 years, regardless of who's president. Remember, under the protections of the JCPOA, the regime squandered away $150 billion. The Iranian people never saw the economic benefits of the Iran deal. What Trita Parsi said would happen never happened. The moderates and the youth never got in a position to marginalize the hardliners, supposedly. But these arguments of if we keep sanctions in place and if we don't negotiate with the regime, we're only going to strengthen the hardliners. I consider that a nice problem to have, because that's a defined, unpopular
do you agree, Mr.
enemy.
Pregent, do you agree with Dr. Apostolou that even if the regime collapses, the IRGC will survive and outlive the regime?
Well, the IRGC will survive regardless. Even if the regime is replaced, there'll be a guerrilla force in civilian clothes doing things. If the regime collapses and a democratic regime or a democratic government takes over, one of the people, I put that in quotations, we'll have an insurgent guerrilla force that would be former IRGC Quds Force operatives. There were also senior leaders that will take their golden parachutes and leave the country. It's tough to be a underpaid Quds Force member. You have the divisions within the Quds Force. They've arrested up to 300 IRGC officers for planning some sort of operation against the regime. We saw that in the news the last year. There's a lot of paranoia in the ranks. There are hardliners in the mid ranks. There are hardliners in the junior ranks. There are also there's competition at the senior ranks. So those are opportunities for the U.S. intelligence community and the international community, intelligence community and military to exploit. There will be no invasion of Iran. There will be no war with Iran. Those days are over. The Americans have no appetite for anything like that. It'll be the language that is coherent in Tehran, that we will punish you 1,000 times stronger is the language of the regime. So when the president says things, it's not for journalists, it's not for Americans, it's not for academia, it's for the regime. When the regime hears something and then Qasem Soleimani is killed, they take the president seriously. This was Trump's Operation Praying Mantis moment. Reagan in 1988 decimated half of the IRGC Navy, and the regime backed down. After Soleimani, we saw the regime willing to give up Iraqi militia leaders in Iraq and allow us to target those as say, let's stand down. Regardless of what media outlet you follow, every media outlet said that the missile attack on the U.S. base in Iraq was a face-saving gesture. It was just basically a way to off-ramp and de-escalate. The American people aren't focused on Iran. Iran may be focused on the American election, but it will be the American football fan that will decide Iran's future in this election. Because the American football fan wants the economy reopened, wants COVID-19 depoliticized, and wants fans back in the stands, wants the Big Ten to play now, and wants a law and order type environment. They may hate Trump, but they want the comfort of hating Trump from a good economy in a safe neighborhood. And our adversaries will pay the price based on what the U.S. football fan does. And what I mean by pay the price is status quo. Sanctions, you hit us, we'll hit you, tit for tat kind of things. I think Iran's in a bad position. And when I say Iran, I mean the Islamic Republic of Iran. And real quick on our Kurdish allies in Iraq. Yes, Obama and Trump abandoned our Kurdish allies in Iraq. But now with the U.S. threat to close down its embassy, it's going to move that capability to Erbil. It's going
we have a question from the
Sure.
audience about the embassy too. Then I will come back to that. But before moving on to the questions, so two of our panelists are saying that that sanctions are strengthening the IRGC, and IRGC may outlive the Iranian regime, but in different forms. According to Dr. Apostolou, IRGC could turn Iran into post-Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
And according to Mr. Pregent, IRGC could be a guerrilla force somewhere fighting in the mountains. Dr. Soleimani, as an insider observant from Iran, do you agree with these propositions that the IRGC can outlive the Iranian regime? It can either turn the country into a post-Soviet Russia with oligarchs and strong men dominating the government, or it will basically turn into Hashd Sha'bi or Hezbollah fighting in the mountains and not having any influence on Tehran, considering and assuming that the Iranian regime will collapse in the next 10 years, as both speakers agree?
I think the most likely course of action, or the most likely outcome in Iran, is that the regime will fall. The most dangerous course of action is that the IRGC will do what the other panelists are saying.
Thank you.
But we can limit that. We can see the things coming. But I also think that this is an argument against sanctions. If we continue sanctions, we're going to get something worse than we have now. We cannot let the most dangerous outcomes constrain our foreign policy. The regime needs to be sanctioned. Mm-hmm. It's the IRGC. It's not new that the IRGC has become a criminal organization penetrating Iran's economy. It's the reason Iran's economy is being sanctioned, because of the IRGC penetration of its economy.
Yeah.
Because of the IRGC could force penetration of the Iraqi economy. So when we talk about Iraq, I definitely have some things to say about that. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Dr. Soleimani.
Since, the IRGC has been the main force and has dominated everything in Iran for a very long time. Actually, when Ahmadinejad came to power in 2009, it was the reassertion of its power. So IRGC has the control of Iran. What might happen in the next election, which probably there wouldn't be much participation, that you have a kind of naked revolutionary guards rule. But there is one more thing, that if the revolutionary guards, I cannot pronounce the thing, I would leave the regime so there is one thing, in the sense that the fact that the Iranian regime might fall I don't think it's a possible thing in the near future. Unfortunately, the way we saw it even the Arab Spring, which it gives us a clue how the situation works. In the countries that their army was listening to the West and they had some financial to the West, as we saw it in certain places like Egypt or in Tunis, the regime collapsed. In places like Syria, we saw that the regime still is in power. There were sanctions on Iraqi regime. It doesn't mean that I'm against sanctions. I'm just trying to explain this scenario. In Iraq, there were sanctions on Iraq and Saddam Hussein for a very long time, and Saddam Hussein was trying to show all the miseries of Iraqis and blaming the sanctions. But anyways, people could not really get rid of Saddam Hussein, despite the fact that even in Iran now, they are talking about the army of the hungry, which is, as Dr. Andrew talked about the situation, how these people are coming out, they are angry, they are dispossessed, but there is still not a possibility that they might be able to get rid of the regime. And there is one more thing about the IRGC, which is that the main opposition, the Persian opposition, because Iran is a multinational country. We have variety of nations or ethno-nations like Kurds, Arabs, Turks, Baluchs, Turkmens. Actually, they have problem with certain parts of the regime. What we have in Iran is an ethno-theocratic regime. It's not.
Does this have an impact on the IRGC, sir?
Yes, because many of the opposition, like previous former Shah's son and other groups, they are happy with the transformation of IRGC, which they wanted to stay in place. And as long as they want to keep it the main skeleton of the regime, just get rid of the mullah, replace it with a secular regime, but it would be still a Persian nationalist regime that would deny all the other groups any kind of rights and recognition. So, and actually one of the main reasons that in Iran the Iranians have not had any form of a unified opposition has been the fact that they are against any rights and recognitions of the non-Persians. So they all, the main opposition groups are all for the keeping Iranian regime with the Persian supremacy.
But can these opposition groups and the popular movement in Iran fall under the IRGC's leadership, as Dr. Apostolou mentioned?
No, they don't want to fall under its.
You didn't mention that?
Yes, but they want some type of metamorphosis, because they want, if they change their size, they won't have any problem with that. And it starts with, there are a variety of things that they talk about the fact that they should change their side. And if this happen, they are already talk about them as the soldiers of the nation, as the protector of the nation, and these are the praises that they receive from the opposition. So one of the main concern of the Persian opposition is that Iran will fall apart and parts of the country will be dismembered, and this is the thing. So that's why they don't have any problem with ethnocratic part of the regime. Mm-hmm. They only have problem with the theocratic part. So if the theocratic part is gone, the rest, they don't have any problem with the RIGC or Revolutionary Guard.
Connecting this to one of the questions we received from the audience today, I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Arzu Yilmaz. And I'd like to address this question to everyone, but starting with Dr. Apostolou. What are the parameters of U.S. interests in countering Iran? Are these only reflect Israeli interests and the U.S. correspondence to protecting Israel, or does the U.S. have any concrete national interest in countering Iran?
Thank you. Well, obviously the U.S. has its own interests separate from Israel. This isn't about Israel. This is about the fact that U.S. installations, U.S. interests, U.S. allies are in the line of fire of Iran. And if it weren't for the fact that Iran was doing things that are fairly obnoxious to these people, there wouldn't be a U.S. interest. The U.S. doesn't have an interest against the nuclear Albania because Albania is not exporting terrorism or destabilizing its neighbors, whereas Iran is. And so this is really about Iran and the U.S. response. I mean, as I said, the original framework, nukes to normalization, reflects the fact that American administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, actually want to have, in the end, a normal diplomatic relationship with Iran, one that is not based on conflict. There's nothing that America gets out of this, quite the contrary. And one of the reasons for the isolationism in American foreign policy is America puts an awful lot into the Middle East and doesn't feel that it gets much out. Let me just say also that it's a complete logical non sequitur to claim that criticism of sanctions is a call for lifting sanctions. That's sort of a Trump-style thought process. I have talked to American officials in the past about the perverse impact of sanctions, and if you've ever dealt with a country that has been under sanctions, or you know what happens in these countries, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Serbia, you see the perverse impact. And the fact is, local interests are very good at making money. Some of the people who make money out of sanctions are just looking after themselves, but some of them are political interests. And we see that in a number of countries, and that's the biggest concern, that a perverse effect of sanctions is strengthening this regime within a regime, a criminal state within a state. It's not the whole IRGC, let me be clear. It's elements of IRGC and others. As for the, there was a question from Matt Johnson about the US Embassy in Baghdad. And I think this is a genuinely very difficult decision for any president to make, because if you close the embassy, it looks like weakness. If you don't close the embassy, you're exposing the Americans there. It's a genuinely very difficult decision. I don't have an answer of my own, but I do believe that it is extremely important that, again, you need to have friends in the region. What America has failed to do is to get friends in Iran, and it is losing friends in Iraq. And if you betray people, as America betrayed the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, you have fewer friends. And, you know, moving the embassy to Erbil is maybe good for the catering business in Erbil, but I think the KRG, once bitten, twice shy, won't fall for this. So again, it keeps happening. I think one of the things I've noticed is that there's an incredible ability to gild the lily. And in particular to say, well, we have better partners in Iraq than we really do. No, we have horrible partners in Iraq, actually. And one of the big mistakes that Obama made was to completely empower the Shia militias and allow Iran to do so, and then say, "Oh, but it's not so bad. It's a problem not so bad to have."
Yeah, but so many people would argue that
ISIS.
the militias could have been strengthened anyway.
Right.
I'd like to pass the word to.
Let me just say.
I'd like to counter.
I'm passing to you, Pregent.
You need to pass to me, because that can't stand.
Trump praised Iran for killing ISIS. So, you know, the decision over the U.S. embassy.
That's not true. That's not true. He didn't say
it's on tape.
It's not on tape. He said the hospital shop. He didn't say Iran, my man. Let's talk about it. All right. The time has expired. I want to say something.
This is a fact. This is a fact. In his debate with Hillary Clinton,
he did not.
Are you going to engage in Trump's?
Iran credited himself for killing ISIS.
Gentlemen, just give me a second to summarize. Summarize my question.
You're
letting the guy talk for 10 minutes. Let me.
I will. I'm passing the word to you. I'm passing the word to you.
The guy. I have a name.
I'm passing the word.
Mr. Pregent, I have a name. I am not the guy.
Don't be so easily offended. Let's get back to the conversation. Go ahead.
I'm not easily offended. I just think it's bad manners.
It sounds like you are. All right.
Gentlemen.
Let me know when I can talk.
Yes, you can right now. So the question is, do you agree that the closure of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad will essentially mean that the U.S. will lose another partner against Iran?
No. 80% of the Iraqis are against this government. I agree with Andrew that we don't have good partners in Iraq. The good partners that we don't have are now in charge of the government. They're the reason for the protests. They're the reason that the militias are strengthened. They're the reason that ISIS has not been defeated. They're the reason that Iran is able to use Iraq as an economic life support system to bypass U.S. sanctions. Closing the embassy, I think, is a smart leverage play, because it doesn't just mean closing the embassy. It means designations. It means sanctions against Iraq's economy. It means going after the Fatah party, going after al-Banaa, going after these parties that the militias actually, that basically empower the militias, because the parties are actually militia leaders in suits. And when it comes to Erbil, yes, we screwed over our Kurdish allies a couple of times, but we're going to move to Erbil, not only to help the, what did you call it, the catering industry? No, it's to defeat ISIS. We're in Syria because we have a UN mandate to go after ISIS. We're in Iraq at the invitation of Baghdad. We're in Syria, and we haven't been invited in by Damascus or Assad. So if we don't have a partner in Baghdad, we will continue under the UN mandate and target ISIS. And we will find allies on the ground. We have strong support with the Shia youth in Iraq. We have strong support with the Sunni tribes in Iraq. And we still have measured support from the Kurds because, again, if the Kurds take a very strong pro-American stance, they will be punished by Baghdad. That's what's happening. The U.S. is not that ally that goes in and protects you, unfortunately. But my thing about, I'm not a Trump guy. I'm a foreign policy guy. But to say that my argument was weak because I said your argument that if we continue sanctions, the IRGC is going to take power and be emboldened. I think that's what I was going after, because if you continue sanctions, this is the worst case scenario. But you didn't talk about the benefits of sanctions. These are targeted sanctions. These sanctions are not on the Iranian people. They're on the regime. They're on IRGC Quds Force banking systems, individuals, metal. It's on the Supreme Leader's $240 billion grouping of companies that basically back channel money to the IRGC Quds Force. None of that money goes to the Iranian people. So, Trump's foreign policy is not meant to impress academics. Okay, it's not meant to impress journalists. It's meant to send a message to adversaries. And I know that the regime is hearing the Trump administration loud and clear. They're hearing the Secretary of State loud and clear. They're getting mixed messages from the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is still not on board with state, still not on board with the agency, and still not on board with the White House. But the president has now replaced people so that they can be, I don't want to call it rubber stamps, but so they're going to say yes because they can't say no. I think this is a time, again, if the president doesn't win, Biden is strengthened. If the president wins, the regime's going to come to the table on its knees to negotiate something because they can't handle another 4 years of maximum pressure. Mm-hmm. And the IRGC Quds Force can't handle 4 more years of maximum pressure. We're not only going after banks, we're going after everywhere the IRGC Quds Force and the IRGC have their fingers in some sort of bypass mechanism to get funds to the organization. So there are things in place that we're looking at, and there are things in place that we're willing to do. But
we spoke about thank you, Michael. We spoke about the policies in a heated debate, the U.S. policy. But what about the challenges? Because I have some questions from the audience, and an interesting one from Umut Fidan mentions the Turkish president and Erdogan's and his closing relationship with Iran. Dr. Soleimani, does the Turkish position vis-a-vis Iran is a hindering factor or a challenging factor for the success of the U.S. policy towards Iran?
Yes, in many ways. But let me just say one thing, that even about the dealing with Iran, then go back to the Turkish issue. Trump himself has not been consistent, and he has given mixed messages. Even just getting rid of John Bolton the way he got rid of him was a bad message to the Iranians. If you are talking about mixed messages, the fact that the American drone was shut down, was brought down, it was again another mixed message. The fact that Iran attacked American bases in Iraq, and there were some wounds and casualties, and people were, they had some brain damage. And actually Trump hid it for a long time. It was a bad message, and actually it emboldened IRGC. So yes, when it comes to the Turkish and the whole incoherence of American foreign policies, starting with Obama, and it continued by by actually Donald Trump has helped many in the region to think of America's, the fact that America's, they know America lacks a coherent strategy. They know it's not reliable, and that's why after actually Trump left Syria, left actually Rojava, where the Kurds are, you had Saudis were getting closer to the Russians because they know they are the ones who are calling the shot in the region. And Turkish president has been in defiance to the Americans, and Americans were subdued, especially Biden, by Erdogan, and then you had pretty much James Jeffrey working as like a Turkish foreign ministry, the way not only deceived Trump and deceived Americans, and we saw what happened. So, and giving all this incoherence in the American foreign policy, and at the same time, Turks have been using Iranian resources, and they have been working as a gate to completely ignore the sanctions. So this is one reality. And not only this has been economically beneficial to the Turks, Erdogan has been using this and posturing about his strong supposedly anti-American gestures, and so using this situation and always talking about the fact that the world is bigger than five members of the Security Council. And even now we see that the fact the vitality of, or so Turkey remaining as the only kind of gate to the outside world economically. Now Iran has completely changed its stance over Nagorno-Karabakh, and just recently said that Armenia is an occupier and they have to get out of there. And so you see how the Turkish president using this situation and gesturing as one of the main power in the region. So
thank you. Thank you. Dr. Apostolou, both our panelists, Michael Pregent and Dr. Kamal Soleimani, mentioned the impact of the US policy towards Iran on the regional countries. And I have questions from the audience, most notably from the Kurdish diplomat Sina Mohammed in Washington, D.C., asking about what can be a possible impact of a shift in the US policy towards Iran regarding the sanctions on Syria and the situation of US allies in Syria, specifically the Kurds.
Thank you. Well, and thank you, Sinam, for the comment. Sorry we can't see you on the video. Lovely to have you at the meeting. Look, US policy on Syria has been a catastrophe from start to finish. And it started with Obama, and it started with an administration that contained people who said, like Samantha Power did, like Susan Rice did, we will stand against human rights atrocities. And when it came to the crunch, they didn't. When it came to the crunch, they walked away. And the time to intervene was 2011 and 2012. That was the time to intervene. And by the time they got to allying with the Kurds, which was an accident, by the way, as you know, right? It was totally accidental, the alliance with the Kurds. It was too late. And so the problem you've got now is Iran and the Syrian regime have basically won in Syria. And the question is, how does the US go about accommodating that? And how does the US go about protecting those bits of Syria that have escaped Iran and the Syrian regime? And I don't see how that's going to be done by anybody coming into power, given that both Democrats and Republicans invited Turkey into Syria. I don't see how they're going to do that. I don't see how they're going to roll that back. You have a de facto partition of Syria. And frankly, given the prevailing isolationism, given America's own focus on itself, I see no reason to believe that there's going to be anything more than a kind of acceptance of the status quo under a pretense that there's a Syrian diplomatic process to put Syria back together. But, you know, there's no reason why the Kurds should compromise. There's no reason why the Turks should compromise. The Americans are not going to go up against the Turks. They're still a NATO ally for all the problems. And frankly, I wish I could give you some better news, Sinan, but I think the reality is that you're just stuck with it. And as you've heard on this talk from Mr. Pregent, Americans like their sanctions. They think sanctions are great. I mean, my view is sanctions are very important, very effective. I have no problem with sanctions. I like them. Personally, I like human rights sanctions. I like going after individuals. I really want to make individuals sweat because that's a form of accountability. I'd like to see them arrested. I'd like to see them put on trial. Sometimes I'd like to see them spared COVID-19, as happened to Kamal Soleimani, bless him. But, you know, Cenk, stop giggling. But, you know, the fact is America is going to keep away from Syria. There's nothing to be gained from going there. I think the focus will be on Iran, and it will be on strengthening the Gulf states.
On this occasion, great, because I have a question about the Gulf states, and I have one question from the audience that I'm going to direct to Michael Pregent, which I find a reasonable question. One of the audience members is asking, what do we know about the Iranian nuclear arsenal? Seriously, 2020, before the US elections, what do we know? What do they have?
Well, what we know is that they use the threat of building a bomb to get concessions, to get sanctions relief. And it's been in the playbook for 40 years. Even before the regime took place, there was already a nuclear program in the works. What we do know is that there were sites that were carved out of the JCPOA. And those are the sites that, in the president's incoherent message to a domestic US audience or to our allies, resonates with the regime when he calls out the sites where these nuclear facilities are, and talks about the 55 targets in Iran. What we do know is that inside the JCPOA or outside the JCPOA, Iran was always 6 months away from a bomb. They still are. When I've talked to Russian counterparts and Chinese counterparts, they've basically said that the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is what they use. They believe that that's enough to stop Iran from crossing these red lines, and that if Iran crossed those red lines, that it would actually be Russia that would take some actions, because at the end of the day, these were think tanks tied to Putin. At the end of the day, they do not want to see the Islamic Republic with a nuclear weapon on their border. That's an issue. The United States can constrain Iran at any time if it moves towards that path towards a bomb. The JCPOA did nothing but actually offer protections as Iran moved towards that goal, while accelerating its malign behavior throughout the region.
I'm running out of time, and I have another question for you.
Yeah, sure.
That's my personal question. So we have seen a lot of coverage regarding possible Israeli presence in the Gulf in the coming months or in the coming years, especially after the treaty between Israel and two Gulf states were signed. If this happens, and if Israel establishes a certain level of presence, be it military or commercial or diplomatic in, let's say, UAE or Bahrain, or potentially maybe in Saudi Arabia, would this lead to an Iranian aggression on these countries, like happened in September 15, 2019, that Saudis called it their own 9/11?
Well, it's an issue.
And two, what would be the respective response of either presidential candidates, Biden or Trump, or the traditional U.S. policy in the face of such threats or aggression?
Yeah, it's again the same issue that the Kurds dealt with the United States. Is the United States a reliable ally? After the strike on the Saudi pipelines, the United States moved in Patriot battery systems into northern Saudi Arabia to protect not against the Houthis, but against Iraqi militias like Kataib Hezbollah and also the IRGC. And then we withdrew those Patriot systems as a gesture to kind of off-ramp and stand down with the regime. And that made our allies, just like Andrew said earlier, talk to other countries. Andrew and Kamal both said this, talk to Russia and China because the U.S. seems to be a wavering ally. We have no consistent foreign policy strategy. I agree. It changes every 2 to 4 years, and I doubt now that a U.S. democracy could even win a conflict because of the constant changings, and that's why we have these prolonged wars. Just real quick, the American people aren't paying attention. I agree with Andrew. There's not going to be any shift in our policy in Syria. The United States is going to be a counter-ISIS campaign and protect Israel, protect Saudi Arabia from Iraqi militias. We're not going to care what the Iraqi militias do inside of Syria, as long as they're not moving offensive capability into Syria to target Israel, to destabilize Jordan, or to target the Gulf region. Americans aren't paying attention. This is not a foreign policy election at all. This is a domestic policy election. And regardless, it will still have effects on the regime, whether Trump wins or Biden wins, because there is no appetite for anything close to the JCPOA again. And everything in the JCPOA expires in 5 to 8 years once Biden comes in place, or 5 to 10 years. And that's just not going to be acceptable to anybody in Congress. The JCPOA passed because Obama had a machine that put pressure on Democrat senators. That machine is not alive anymore. Biden is not the talent, and you never run the talent against an incumbent president. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens, but Americans are tired of war. They're happy with sanctions. They're happy with drone strikes against terrorist leaders. It's just the reality of it.
Thank you, Michael. I apologize to everyone in the audience who posted questions, and I didn't have time, or I mismanaged my time to get to all these questions, but I think it was a very knowledgeable and informative webinar. I thank each member of the panelists, Dr. Apostolou, Dr. Soleimani, Mr. Pregent, for their striking insights on the U.S. policy towards Iran. The audience, we were today with 3 distinguished guests for the Washington Kurdish Institute's 8th panel webinar. And today we focused on the U.S. policy towards Iran, and definitely after the elections, the Institute will organize more events to discuss on the same subject matter. Thank you very much for your participation, the guests, and thank you very much for the audience.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you.